Good afternoon. In the absence of the chairman, it's my privilege to call this meeting to order. After a disaster strikes, victims want to know that they will have the financial resources to recover. Immediate disaster assistance is led by state governments, along with assistance from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. However, long-term recovery is the responsibility of the Small Business Administration. Disaster assistance offered by the SBA helps homeowners, renters, businesses, and nonprofit organizations by offering long-term recovery loans. When working properly, SBA programs help people rebuild their homes and businesses after they have been destroyed. SBA loans also help businesses that suffer economic losses resulting from a community struggling to get back on its feet. What victims do not need is endless paperwork, misinformation, and delays. It's essential that SBA maintain the capacity to get money quickly into the hands of people who need the funds to rebuild. By properly planning and continually reassessing how it offers assistance, SBA can be better prepared to respond in times of emergency. Our role is to oversee SBA's implementation of statutory changes to the disaster loan program and to ensure that it is meeting the needs of disaster victims. I find it troubling that in 2009, almost 4 years after Hurricane Katrina, GAO reported that they were not comfortable that SBA could meet the challenges of another disaster on the scale of Katrina. Today, GAO continues to report that laws passed in 2008 are not fully implemented. While I appreciate the progress that has been made, SBA needs to make disaster recovery a higher priority. There are too many people relying on SBA for assistance to rebuild their homes and their businesses for us not to get this right. With that, I look forward to receiving an update on SBA's implementation of statutory changes and how those changes have helped SBA respond to recent disasters. I'm also interested in hearing what else can be done to make sure SBA is prepared to respond to any disaster we might face in the future. I would now like to yield to my good friend and ranking member, Vasquez, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for yielding. With so much of the national attention focused today on the holiday season, it is easy for Americans to lose sight of the risks posed by Mother Nature. But the reality is that natural disasters can occur in times and places where they are least expected. From fires in Texas to an earthquake in Virginia and a hurricane in the Northeast, the events of the past summer have shown the need for disaster readiness in every part of the country. Today, we will examine whether the SBA's Disaster Assistance Program is prepared to meet this challenge and whether reforms enacted in the 110th Congress have been fully implemented by the agency. Since the agency's creation in 1953, the SBA has performed its disaster assistance mission. Today, the SBA's disaster loans are the primary form of federal assistance for the repair and rebuilding of private sector losses and are not limited to small businesses. SBA loans help homeowners rebuild their homes and can help every disaster victim replace damaged personal possessions. SBA loans can even help businesses cover the economic losses they experience as the result of a disaster. But those of us who have been on the committee for some time know that SBA also has a history of struggles with its disaster assistance programs. Nowhere was this more apparent than under the disaster loan program, which faced significant challenges following Hurricane Katrina. At the time, we asked GAO to take a look at the program and evaluate the agency's response to the hurricane. The resulting reports led to the passage of the Disaster Response and Loan Improvements Act. That law laid the foundation for important reforms to the Disaster Assistance Program. It fixed the shortcomings uncovered by Katrina and gave the agency new tools to better leverage its resources and coordinate with the private sector. In 2009, a full year after the passage of the Disaster Response and Loan Improvements Act, the committee held hearings to evaluate the agency's progress in making reforms. At that time, the SBA had yet to fully implement 13 out of 26 provisions contained in the Act. In the 2 years since then, some progress has been made toward full compliance with the law, But as we will hear today, a great deal of work remains to be done. In addition to obstacles in effective disaster planning, SBA has struggled to meet deadlines on critical reports. Additionally, the agency has chosen to implement new bridge loan initiatives on a trial basis, even pilot programs that were not called for. And perhaps most notably, the agency has made very, very little progress in implementing a private disaster assistance program. It is important that these issues be resolved. Should another major disaster strike, it will be critical that the agency have a framework in place to deliver bridge assistance and private loans to victims. In examining the current state of the disaster assistance program, it is clear that there is still significant work to be done, and the stakes could not be higher. It is estimated that between 40 and 60% of businesses fail to recover from a natural disaster. This is why it's so important that the agency get it right. Our economy is counting on small firms to drive growth and create jobs. We simply cannot afford to lose these engines of growth. In making sure they're able to do that, we need an SBA that can step up to the plate and meet its mission to deliver disaster assistance where it's needed most. I would like to thank both Mr. Rivera and Mr. Scheer for being here for this discussion, and I know we all look forward to hearing what they have to say. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Our first witness is James Rivera, Associate Administrator of the Office of Disaster Assistance at the Small Business Administration. In this role, Mr. Rivera is responsible for all aspects of the SBA disaster loan-making programs. During this time, Mr. Rivera has worked at modernizing the disaster relief applications process, including the implementation of the electronic loan application. Mr. Rivera, welcome to our committee, and we look forward to your testimony.
Good afternoon, Congressman Bartlett, Ranking Member Velasquez, and Chairman Graves, and the distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to discuss SBA's disaster assistance programs. SBA's Office of Disaster Assistance provides financial assistance in the form of low-interest loans. Earlier last week, SBA reached a milestone in providing more than $50 billion in disaster loans. We're proud to help homeowners and businesses get back on their feet after a disaster. Although SBA is not a first responder agency, we are on the ground immediately following a disaster. SBA's primary focus is providing low-interest, long-term loans as part of the recovery efforts in coordination with other government partners at the federal, state, and local levels. Additionally, SBA offers economic injury disaster loans to small businesses, small agricultural cooperatives, and most private nonprofit organizations who have suffered economic injury caused by a disaster. These loans provide working capital to a business or organization until normal operations can resume following a disaster. Since the 2005 Gulf Coast hurricanes, SBA has made dramatic improvements in our operation, and we see a great deal of success because of that. SBA is now better prepared to process loans faster, provide a better quality of service, and be more helpful to disaster survivors. To ensure overall preparedness, the disaster program has increased the number of workstations from 366 to 1,750 in our Fort Worth, Texas operation, and we've added a surge center in Sacramento, California with 350 additional workstations. Our core staff of 850 regardless of activity, and we have a pool of over 2,000 disaster reservists who we can draw from. During Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee, we peaked at 1,750 staff. On top of this, we've increased the disaster credit management system's capacity from 800 to 10,000 concurrent users. Throughout the year, we've invested in staff to increase their skills, streamline the loan process, improve technology, reduce contracting costs, and implement a new staffing strategy for ODA. Under the newly implemented staffing strategy, we're able to increase staff, train and deploy an additional 900 employees within 3 weeks in many of your congressional districts during the response to Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee. From a loan processing perspective, we're currently exceeding our processing goals by approving or declining loan application requests within 8 days for homeowners and 10 days for business owners during fiscal year 2011. Our goal is 14 days for homeowners and 18 days for businesses. In response to Irene and Lee, SBA is processing loan applications in less than 10 days on average. To put this in perspective, the average processing time during the Gulf Coast hurricanes was 74 days for disaster home loans and 66 days for disaster business loans. Additionally, in August of 2008, SBA introduced an electronic loan application which allows disaster survivors to apply for assistance online. SBA has also revamped the post-approval process and improved processes and tools for loan closing and funding disbursements. To ensure coordination and collaboration across the board, SBA also works closely with our sister agencies. For instance, SBA and FEMA have consistently worked together in order to effectively provide assistance to disaster survivors, including implementing internal agency agreements for continual electronic data exchange. Since the beginning of Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee, SBA has approved more than $355 million in disaster loans to help more than 9,200 homeowners, renters, businesses, and nonprofit organizations recover and rebuild from the devastation caused by Irene and Lee. Additionally, SBA has responded to the needs of residences and business owners by deploying 600 SBA disaster staff workers and field inspectors to staff 163 disaster recovery centers located throughout the East Coast to assess damage to homes and businesses in 12 states and Puerto Rico. At these centers, SBA representatives are providing one-on-one service to disaster survivors and have personally met with more than 16,000 disaster survivors to answer questions, explain SBA's disaster program, help complete loan applications, and close disaster loans. In addition, homeowners and businesses can call our disaster call center in Buffalo, New York, which has handled over 61,000 calls relating to Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee. In closing, we appreciate the opportunity to share with the committee the role SBA plays in the small business disaster recovery efforts, and we believe that the reforms we've instituted and the new tools Congress has provided to us will allow us to effectively and efficiently respond to the needs of our nation's citizens. I look forward to further describing these efforts and answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our second witness is Bill Scheer, who is Director of the Financial Markets and Community Investment Team at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Mr. Scheer is a frequent guest before this committee, providing testimony on a broad range of SBA oversight issues. Mr. Scheer, welcome back to the committee, and we look forward to your testimony.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Velazquez, and members of the committee, it's really a pleasure to be here today to discuss our work on reforms made to the Small Business Administration's Disaster Loan Program. After the 2005 Gulf Coast hurricanes, many deficiencies were exposed in the program and demonstrated the need for reform. Since then, SBA has taken several steps to reform its program, which includes creating an online loan application and increasing the capacity of its disaster credit management system. In June 2008, Congress enacted the Small Business Disaster Response and Loan Improvement Act, which places new requirements on SBA to ensure that it is prepared for future catastrophic disasters. We first reported to this committee in July 2009 on SBA's actions to address the Act's requirements, and in our report, we made 5 recommendations to SBA to facilitate progress in meeting and complying with these requirements and improve the disaster loan program. My statement today provides updated information on SBA's actions. SBA has continued to make progress in addressing provisions of the Act, although continued attention to certain provisions will be important for sustained progress. SBA has met requirements for 16 of 26 provisions of the Act and partially addressed 6. 4 provisions do not require any action at this time. For example, in terms of progress made, SBA updated its disaster recovery plan annually, most recently in June 2011. SBA also has taken steps to address the Act's requirements for region-specific marketing and outreach. The agency has begun a dialogue with the state directors of small business development centers in the Gulf Coast about disseminating disaster planning information in the 5 most hurricane-prone states before the hurricane season. Additionally, SBA officials told us that the agency has issued some public service announcements in disaster-prone areas. SBA has issued annual reports to Congress on disaster assistance in 2009, 2010, and 2011 as required by the Act. As we have reported in the past, the biggest challenges SBA appears to have experienced in its attempt to fully address the Act's requirements involve making extensive changes to current programs or implement new programs. In particular, SBA still plans to implement pilots before finalizing regulations for 2 programs that would involve private lenders making short-term loans to applicants awaiting assistance. With respect to recommendations we made in our 2009 report, SBA has taken steps to implement 3 of the 5 recommendations. These 3 recommendations address fulfilling the Act's region-specific marketing and outreach requirements, to complete its annual report to Congress, and to issue updated disaster recovery plan. Beginning 12 days ago, on November 18th, SBA has been providing us information responsive to these recommendations, and we have continued to receive information since my written statement was completed and provided for this hearing. Our final 2 recommendations were for the agency to, first, develop an implementation plan and report to Congress on its progress in addressing all of the Act's requirements, and second, to develop and implement a formal process to identify problems in the disaster loan application process and make improvements for future applicants. Here, SBA officials and we have agreed to continue a dialogue on actions that could lead to improvements in the disaster loan program. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Velazquez, and members of the committee, it's really a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your testimony. As is usually my practice when I chair a committee, I reserve my questions until the end, hoping that they will have been asked by my colleagues. So I yield now to our ranking member, Ms. Velazquez.
Thank you. Mr. Scheer, given everything that you have reviewed in your past reports, are you comfortable that the SBA is prepared for another disaster on the scale of Hurricane Katrina or a major earthquake on the West Coast?
As 2 years ago, when I was here before this committee, you asked that question, and my answer at that time, I think, is more negative than the answer you'll hear from me today. But let me divide it into 3 pieces. First, I say it's relative. I think SBA is better prepared than it's ever been to deal with any disaster, including one of the scale of Katrina. I think they have made improvements in their program. The second part of this is that when we looked at the 2008 floods, again at your request, for this committee, even though those were on a much smaller scale, we did see that the responsiveness of the agency to those disasters was much greater than we had seen in the past. So again, it's consistent with improvements in the program. The third part of this is what causes me to say we're still uncertain. So I'll say I hope SBA is prepared for another Katrina. But the third part of this, which is part of what was passed in the Act, which is to perform simulation exercises. And the simulation exercises in the after-action reports were not completed at the time we reported to you 2 years ago. And you realize now we've had interactions with SBA, but we still have not seen the results of those simulation exercises. And given that you haven't had another Katrina since then, the results of those exercises, at least in principle, should allow SBA to address that question and to really give a good answer, because that's the part of the evidence that's missing for us.
So what are the reasons given to you since you finalized your report for not doing the exercise of the simulation?
I think the agency has done simulation exercises. We have never actually explicitly asked for the results of them because we haven't had ongoing audits of those programs. We would be glad to look at them either at the initiative of SBA or this committee. We'd be glad to look at them and to have discussions about what is ready for public consumption and things of that nature. But we haven't explicitly asked for them because we haven't had an ongoing audit where it was necessary for us to complete our work.
Okay. SBA, Mr. Scheer, failed to make use of its authority to defer or refinance loans for businesses affected by Hurricane Katrina, Rita, or Wilma. My question to you is, if they had, do you believe that the Gulf Coast region would have recovered more quickly?
I can't answer the question explicitly, but directly, but these are the things I would point to, is that SBA disaster loans, they have certain requirements, certain underwriting requirements, collateral requirements. And one of our experiences from our work we've done in the Gulf Coast over the years is that there was felt a need, such as in Louisiana, to have state-run programs. So I'd say that to fill part of the void, there were state loan programs and grant programs that were run to try to address the needs that SBA could not address. And then there were community development block grant funds provided by HUD that were used to support some of that state activity. So it is clear that the SBA disaster loans did not fulfill what was considered necessary for the recovery of the Gulf Coast. But given that those state programs are there, I don't know how much extra would have resulted from additional federal program. So again, something more than SBA disaster loans seemed to be needed, but to some degree, it was addressed by the state-run programs.
In your testimony, you noted difficulties that the SBA has had in making its annual reports to Congress in a timely fashion as it is required by the statute. What is causing the agency to repeatedly miss these deadlines? Is it a lack of staff or a failure to prioritize?
I want to bridge that to our experience with open recommendations. We're not quite sure whether it's due to communication problems within the agency in terms of the liaison function, the congressional relations function, or more substantively with the program functions. So those are things that, based on personal experience, I can point to. But it does seem like there is a lack of prioritization in terms of saying what is necessary and what is required, and make sure that we are that the agency is meeting those requirements.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rivera, with the economic recovery still at an early stage, the effects of a natural disaster can be especially challenging. Section 12068 of the Disaster Response and Loan Improvement Act gave victims of the most severe disaster the option of longer payment deferrals. With many people still struggling, will your agency make use of this authority?
Congressman Velasquez, we currently have the authority to grant deferments, and we do on a case-by-case basis.
So you've done it?
Yes, ma'am. We did. A good example is the BP oil spill. We provided many deferments to existing SBA homeowners and businesses in the impacted area.
Okay, I have more questions, so in the second round, I will be making those questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schilling.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, fellas. I guess I'll start out with Mr. Rivera. The SBA covers losses not covered by insurance, and how closely does the SBA work with insurance companies to make sure the costs are allocated properly?
Congressman Schilling, what we actually do is we send out a field inspector, and the field inspector goes to the property, and they come up with an estimate of what it's going to cost to repair, replace the damaged property. We encourage disaster survivors to go ahead and apply first and not wait for an insurance recovery. That way we can go ahead and get the funds in the rebuilding process through quicker, and then we can work with the insurance companies once the settlement is made. The difference between when we do an inspection and when an insurance company does an inspection is we do it based on fair market value, where most insurance companies will take a depreciated value approach. So there is a gap, and usually that's what our loan entails.
Oh, very good. And then also, disaster victims still report that there are numerous paperwork burdens between related to the IRS paperwork. And how closely do you guys work to improve that gap?
Yes, sir. That's something that we also hear. We've worked closely with the Internal Revenue Service. We actually have a one-page form, and not to get technical here, but it's called an IRS Form 8821. And what it does is once a disaster survivor signs that one-page form, it enables us to go directly to the Internal Revenue Service, and we get copies of their tax transcripts, certain items. So we've streamlined that process, where in the old days we used to ask for 3 years of federal tax returns, paper copies, bring that in. We currently have that as part of our streamlined process where they fill out that one page. It's just they sign it, and we can provide that to the Internal Revenue Service, and then they can provide us with copies of their tax transcripts.
Very good. That's streamlining.
Thank you.
Awesome. And then, Mr. Scheer, just a couple of questions. Has the SBA developed a system to make improvements based on customer services, from surveys that you might be getting back?
SBA has they have some good tools. They have taken some actions in terms of there is an annual survey of customers that they receive information. Mr. Rivera and others state that when they're out in the field that they do listen to people. What we're looking for is more of a formal process, especially when whether it's the resource partners like the small business development centers and others involved in the process, when we conduct our audit work, we hear of certain pain points. Some have to do with the topic you just brought up, having to do particularly with the business loans. But we think that it would be useful for the agency to have more of a formal process to try to deal with these pain points, whether it comes from the annual survey or whether it comes from other sources, and to have a formal process to act on it.
Very good. And then lastly, since most disaster victims first must apply for FEMA assistance, are the applications you feel are falling through cracks when being transferred between the two agencies, or is that something that we've got a pretty good grip on also?
Okay, you're asking me? Okay. We saw that process was really very badly broken after Hurricane Katrina. And that was the one time we looked really in depth at that process. And part of the problem was when FEMA referred to SBA, that SBA took so much time to reach a decision. And especially if it was a decline decision, it was hurting the recipient or the victim. It was harming them by not getting a rejection to be able to go back to FEMA. So that process was broken down. We have not looked at that process since our work following Hurricane Katrina.
So would you say that since Katrina, have we had any disasters that would really help us test the system out to see how tuned up it is?
We have, and this, I'll refer to my answer to Ranking Member Velazquez, that we have some windows, including the report we did for this committee, what we looked at the 2008 disasters. It gives a window as far as how responsive is SBA, how are things working, coming up with certain recommendations having to do with, loan application process and things of that nature. So we have a certain window, but we do not quite see, the extent of a disaster anywhere of the magnitude of Katrina. But we have seen, for example, looking at the Act, that there have been certain regulations for working with FEMA. So we haven't gone out and tested those regulations, but we do observe that there's regulations in place to address that problem.
Okay, very good. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of questions on the interest rate calculation. You indicate in your testimony, or maybe in the report, that interest rates are determined based upon the availability of credit from other sources. Can you describe for me exactly how that formula works? Either one who'd like to take a stab at it.
I'll take that one. The interest rate calculation it's a credit elsewhere test is what we do. It's a very simplified test. Basically, it looks at the available cash flow, and I would say 85–90% of the time, the individuals get the lower rate. In the case of Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee, that's 2.5% for homeowners and 4% for businesses. And the credit elsewhere rate is 5% for homeowners and 6% for businesses.
Is that in any way tied to, if you will, the cost of funds to the government for these loans?
The subsidy calculation does have a connection with the, the credit elsewhere determination, or actually the number of loans that are made.
Well, really what I'm asking is the currently borrowing rates for the government are 1% or less in general. And I'm asking whether or not the interest rate calculation is based upon the cost of funds to the government.
Right. The interest rate calculation is statutorily determined. I mean, it's a formula that we follow, and it's basically the home rate is based on treasuries, and the business rate is basically like the 7A loan. It's based on prime plus the spread that we get on a 7A loan.
Okay. All right. Thanks. The other issue that the testimony and report raised was the issue of collateralization of these loans. How do you make that determination if someone's home has essentially been destroyed or their business has been destroyed? What is the collateral that they can offer, or is that collateralization determined based upon the anticipated rebuild?
In collaterals, it's a real simple calculation. I mean, it's a real simple approach. Basically, what we do is we take the best available collateral. So if you have a home that's been damaged, and let's say you had it's worth $100,000, and we make, you have a $50,000 mortgage, and we make $100,000 of repairs, we'll take a second lien position. The homeowner will be upside down, but that's why we enable, the loan to be for 30 years. But we don't have to be in a first lien position. We don't have any loan-to-value loan-to-value ratios. We take whatever is best available from, the applicant.
So in effect, you could have a piece of property that currently has a fair market value of $25,000, had a cost of $100,000, and you would give a loan based upon the cost.
We would give a loan based on what it costs to replace the damage, and then we would attach a lien on the amount of that loan, okay, whether it's $50,000 or $200,000.
Okay, good. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Mr. Scheer, Mr. Rivera, thanks for being here. Mr. Scheer, could you maybe give me a little more background, and apologize if I missed it. The GAO report came out with 26 items that they'd listed. You were alluding to 5 that you've been working on. But I believe there were another 6 provisions that they'd suggested. And the one of immediate interest to me right now is establishing immediate disaster assistance program for getting dollars back to small businesses. Can you tell me how that's progressing?
Our understanding on that program was when we were before this committee, in the past, that SBA wanted to pilot that program. And we're very sympathetic with pilots when you don't quite understand how a program's going to work and what the risks are of a particular program. As of the information we've just gotten for this hearing, the regulations are in place, but the pilot hasn't occurred yet. And I think that's related to it's to be operated by the Office of Capital Access at SBA. And they've been quite busy. Our understanding is with the Recovery Act provisions. So that pilot has not occurred as of yet. And it seems these other private loan programs are to some degree, those not being implemented, are to some degree related to the pilot on the immediate disaster assistance loans not being used yet. That's our understanding of it.
It's a work in progress. Mr. Rivera, disaster loans are made directly by the SBA and not through the network of lending partners. And I'd just like to get your thoughts. Do you think that's a good idea, bad idea?
Well, we've been doing it this way since 1953, and we feel we have the capacity and the ability to provide this service to the disaster victims. We cut out having to go through, a guaranteed loan, for example, like on the 7A side. So we deal directly with the disaster victims because it's a unique situation. It's not a working capital loan. It's not an expansion loan. It's usually debt on top of debt. And so we've established this relationship, and we feel like we're prepared, and we feel like we can do it comfortably.
Okay. Where you get a little bit of crossover, maybe just like to have your thoughts on it, between SBA loans, some of the private loans, particularly in disaster relief. Dodd-Frank has obviously helped freeze some of the credit markets that are out there. Are you seeing some real impacts when we're talking about seeing recovery and response after a disaster?
Well, we've seen a weakness in the economy in 2008, in 2009, no doubt about that. But we continue to provide assistance to the individuals based on their available cash flow from that perspective and an adequate credit. We're the most aggressive lender in town. We'll make the loans that the lenders won't make. And from the perspective of a lender providing the service, if there's a lender out there that's providing bridge loans, we will definitely look at taking out that bridge loan. So I mean, we work with some lenders across the country that have that bandwidth.
Okay. Is it your thought, since you first have to apply to FEMA and then ultimately to the SBA, is there a way to be able to bridge that, or is that creating more problems?
Well, it's a seamless process. The reason we want disaster survivors to apply first with FEMA is that we want them to be available for all types of resources that are available on behalf of the federal government. There's crisis counseling, there's medical, dental, funeral. There's all kinds of available immediate assistance that's available to help them with minimal repairs to their home or from that perspective. So once they go through that, there's a minimum income test, and if they are below that threshold, the individual disaster survivor, they stay with FEMA and they move over to the grant program. If they're
where you say that's seamless, I guess what I'm curious about is just some of the time frame.
So somebody will register with FEMA today. You'll call on their FEMA, the 1-800 FEMA phone number, and you'll register today with FEMA. They'll take some preliminary information, and then they will turn around and they will send us the referral that same day. Our computers are linked up. That's something that we've done since KRW. We have a computer matching agreement where we get several dumps throughout the day, if I can use a computer term, where they actually provide us this information. Once we get this information, we mail out an application, and we're looking at ways of being a little bit more proactive. For example, we can call them. These are some of the process improvements we're currently looking at, as far as like maybe giving them a call and saying, you just registered with FEMA, we're with SBA, and we provide the loan program, and you need to provide an application with us. And then we go through that process. Once we actually get the application back, we're processing in 10 days. Unfortunately, Katrina wasn't our best day in from a disaster perspective. We were doing, 60 to 70 days just to decline or approve a loan. What we've done is we've re-engineered that process where we don't take an applicant through the entire process. We can tell pretty much up front who's an obvious decline, and we go and refer those individuals back to FEMA.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Go back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Chu.
Thank you. Mr. Rivera, I was in New Orleans at the beginning of November at a hearing pertaining to the BP oil spill. There were many Asian American, particularly Vietnamese fishermen there, and they shared many of their stories about the aftermath. Of course, they've had a hard time getting back on their feet, and they did not seem to know much about SBA disaster loans, and were unclear about whether or not they could still apply for it. As you may know, the literacy rate in the community is very low, as well as their understanding of English for many of the fishermen. How do you ensure that small businesses like this are aware of your loan program and that they can actually understand the language on it as well?
Thank you, Congresswoman Chu. We actually work closely with FEMA on presidential declarations. Now, I know the BP oil spill, from an administration's perspective, we did an SBA declaration based on a governor's certification that there were 5 businesses which sustained substantial economic injury. But in the case of the BP oil spill, we actually went into communities, and if we found a pocket, for example, if there was a Vietnamese language or whatever the language was, we often have the skill set within our existing staff, and if we don't, we'll pick up an interpreter there locally that can help us communicate. We have usually an interview takes anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes explaining the program with the disaster victim when we're face to face. But if it takes us an hour, if it takes us longer than that, we have the time and we spend the time to get that application back with the information that we need and to communicate that. We also do town hall meetings, And we'll also meet with the local small business development centers, the resource partners on the ground, who in the BP oil spill were very instrumental in helping us with businesses that may not have had the financial aptitude to be able to provide us with the information. So we had an SBDC partner right next to us, and they were able to help us with, okay, this is what we mean when we want a financial statement. This is what we need from a balance sheet. This is what we need from an income statement. And they're able to really help us provide bridge that communication gap from that perspective.
And if they were monolingual in another language or primarily spoke some other language, what happened there?
We also have the ability, we have a service, national call line service, where when those individuals talk with our call agents up in Buffalo, New York at the call center, or at our processing center in Fort Worth, where we have a call service where we can actually have an interpreter walk us through or explain, interpreter from disaster survivor to interpreter to us. And we're very sensitive to the language requirements in different parts of the country. But we go in, and from a FEMA perspective, they also assist us because they'll go in with community relations group, and they'll hit the different pockets, and they'll go door to door, and we usually assist them there too.
Do you have translated documents?
No, ma'am. We have, what we do is our forms are currently in English and Spanish, but in the event that a local, there's the Vietnamese community, they will also assist us in translating the documents for us. So we don't have, because the dialects change. I'm from Texas. I'm a Mexican American. My Spanish is different than somebody from New York, or the dialects are different from across the different parts of the country. So we rely on the local community to help us with the translation services, and they're usually pretty receptive to providing that help to us.
Do you know how many fishermen applied for the economic injury disaster loans?
I don't have that information with me in my book here, but I'll be glad to get that information back to you.
Yeah, I'd like to know what that is. And I'd also like to know, many of the fishermen on the Gulf operate on a cash basis, and they lost documents during Hurricane Katrina, and some then lost whole livelihoods based on the oil spill. And they might not have the documentation required for typical loans. What kind of flexibility do you have there?
And if I can go back, I know we approved about $41 million in bridge loans for the BP oil spill, and obviously the Gulf Coast Claims Facility was the facility that was in place to help BP, and I think they've provided like $5 or $6 billion worth of service. But how do we deal with individuals? We deal with a lot of businesses, and in the old days, we used to require individuals to bring in copies of their tax returns. And as I mentioned earlier, what we do now is we actually have them sign a IRS Form 8821, and we can copies of their tax transcripts. Being a federal agency, we give them credit for whatever they report to the federal government, and then that kind of allays any issues as far as being a cash business or whatever type of business they are. Whatever they report to the federal government to the IRS is what we give them credit for.
And that would be adequate for the loan then?
Yes, ma'am. That's what we use for repayment ability, or for part of our repayment analysis.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Barletta.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Scheer, after the combination of Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee hit northeastern Pennsylvania, my district experienced the worst flooding in its history. And they're still dealing with it as we speak. I just came back with Chairman John Mica, who came to see the damages. Speaker John Boehner was there as well. And many of the businesses in our area are making decisions whether or not they even want to go back in business again. I traveled throughout the district and talked to many of the business owners, and I told them what the United States will do through the Small Business Administration is, if you can get credit elsewhere, we'll provide you with a 6% loan. I could tell you the reception was not very warm when I told them this is the help we have to offer, especially when a business is just trying to decide whether or not they're even going to stay in business again. The United States gave Pakistan for flood disaster relief $215 million in the last 2 years. The interest rate that we charged the flood disaster victims in Pakistan was zero, with no payback. Do you believe a 6% loan is meeting the needs of disaster victims here in the United States?
I don't have a basis to answer your question. I have to rule out, not knowing what our assistance to Pakistan was. Yeah, I'll make the.
Well, how about just the 6% loan?
Well, just a 6% loan. I'll make the observation that SBA is part of our recovery framework. So there are other federal programs involved, as I alluded to in work in the Gulf Coast. So I can't comment on it directly. I'd say it's a question for the Congress in terms of we don't make value judgments when we evaluate programs as far as how much assistance should be provided and at what cost. So the question really is
how is the interest rate determined?
The interest rate, and Mr. Rivera can speak to the interest rate much better than I can. The credit elsewhere requirement, I think, is intended to make it a lower cost program than it would be, and the 6% interest rate makes it a lower cost program than if a lower interest rate were offered. So there's certainly trade-offs there, and but except for observing that, we don't have audit work that would let me respond directly. The one thing that I will say that does relate to our audit work is that, and it gets to these pain points that many times the victims of disasters feel, is that SBA is saying apply to us and apply to us. And it's good that SBA is out there and reaching out in these disaster recovery centers and the like. But it's important to know what the pain points are and to make sure that SBA is being very transparent about what is being offered and not offered. So that gets to our audit work.
See, I'm very concerned, especially with unemployment over 9%, and we're trying to create jobs and keep jobs here in America. And when a disaster strikes, America, and I've said this here in this committee before, and I'm going to say it again, when disaster strikes, America is the first country to come to the aid of other countries around the world, and I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of that fact. But when you see disaster strike the people in your neighborhood and your friends and relatives, and you know that we're sometimes doing more for people we don't even know, sometimes countries that don't even like us, than we are for Americans. I just believe that we should take care of Americans first. I'm hoping to change the way America deals with disasters. I'm introducing a bill that would give a 1% loan for 30 years. It would cover the administrative costs, but let's get Americans back up on their feet again, and hopefully they'll stay in business and create those jobs that we're trying to do here every day.
I think you raise a very good point, and I hope you just understand that we're a fact-based agency, and we can only comment, and I can only comment based on the facts from the audit work we have conducted.
I'm not upset with you, Mr.
Okay.
Chair. I'm just frustrated, after spending so much time with these people and seeing how hard they've worked, and knowing that we can do more for Americans. And I hope I'll find many colleagues here that will agree with me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. And gentlemen, good to see you today. Mr. Scheer, question. I saw back in 2009 the GAO did a report, and they had some provisions that had to be worked out. I think it was about 14 of the 26. Have we gone back and recertified to make sure that those provisions, as far as this program, have been worked out and been rectified?
Well, in the statement submitted for today, we have 16 of the 26 provisions have been addressed by SBA. There still are, 5 provisions that are still left. I hope I'm remembering the number right. It's and partially addressed 6 of them. So there's still six provisions that have not been fully addressed.
So is there a plan to make sure we can close that out? Because one of the things, we just come out of hurricane season down in our neck of the woods, and so I would want to hope that before we can rectify these things before we go into the next hurricane season. So,
just over the last couple of weeks, we've had some interactions, with Mr. Rivera and his team, And we think that SBA is getting close on some of the provisions, and the ones that seem to remain the biggest challenges have to do with loan programs involving private lenders.
Okay. Mr. Rivera, Hurricane Wilma, pretty important to us down there, and that was the last major storm that we had in the southeast Florida area. Do you have any information that we could get later from you as far as what were the relief that you gave to small businesses as a result of Hurricane Wilma, and maybe we can go back and track and see how those businesses are doing today?
Oh, absolutely. We can get you that information.
Okay, I appreciate it. The other thing, you know, being from the military, I saw that a major disaster response plan to conduct a disaster simulation exercise at least once every 2 years. Can you kind of give us an idea of what that simulation exercise is like, and you know, have you kept on par doing it every 2 years, and what did you learn from it?
Yes, Congressman. We actually do more than one every 2 years. We partner with FEMA. And they have a national level exercise every year. But for example, as a requirement of the Farm Bill, we do a biennial exercise. There's a peer of mine, his name's Steve Smith. He's with the Office of Disaster Planning. He actually creates the simulation. So if we go back to 2008, at the time FEMA had done the Chesapeake Bay hurricane. It was a mock hurricane that came through the national capital area here. We simulated the exact same type of disaster. So the test goes like this. You know, it's a one-day exercise, but in the morning, what we'll do is we'll look at the track of the hurricane, the impact, and we have, for example, we have models. FEMA has us models that tell us the number of businesses, the number of units, structures impacted in the path of disaster. Then we go through a scalability model internally where we know pretty precisely how many field inspectors we need, how many customer service reps we need on the ground, how many loan officers we need, how many case managers we need. So we go through that whole process. We bring in all my staff, my senior management staff from all my centers, and then the Office of Field Operations brings in the district directors and regional administrators from the impacted area, and then we have the administrator, the deputy administrator, and the senior team that's there who's dealt with this. For example, for Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee, we were watching both of these storms, and actually we had Tropical Storm Maria that also hit Puerto Rico. We're actually watching these storms days before they come out. I mean, that's one nice thing about a hurricane. It gives you plenty of warning time. So we were positioning, pre-positioning, calling up reservists, and we were going through that whole process. So that the simulation is kind of a scope from that perspective. So what happens after this is that they call it a hot wash. I'm not sure why they use that.
I know what a hot wash is.
So we have a hot wash, and they actually explain you could do this better, you could do that better. We've actually had several of these simulations. I'm not sure why. I was a little bit surprised that a lot of these these requirements have not been closed out, because we thought we'd closed out all but 3. But we're committed to work with GAO and Mr. Scheer on getting these finally resolved, because in our mind, we've really actually gone through the process. But the simulation, it's a good exercise. It tests us, and there's independence between the Office of Disaster Planning and the Office of Disaster Assistance.
Well, last question. Did you find out, you know, when I talk about my colleague, Congressman Barletta, did things work smoothly in rectifying a lot of the situations that he had in his area?
Well, we actually had an early on conversation with Congressman Barletta. He was gracious enough to let us know where the pockets of businesses that we could possibly set up a business recovery center. So we were early into the conversation with him, and we had set up a couple of business recovery centers in the disaster impacted area. You know, and FEMA helps us with disaster. The governor's office and the states help us with disaster recovery centers between the state, FEMA, and SBA. But we also, when we have situations like we had in Congressman Barletta's backyard, where there's businesses there's a pocket of businesses that we can help. So we set up a couple of business recovery centers to try to see what we could do from that perspective.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. Mr. Rivera, I am a member born and raised and live in New Orleans, and I don't have to tell you about the Katrina experience, but I say that to say that I've seen the agency probably at its worst, and I see it now at a different plight. And I would just urge you to be as candid and honest with us as possible to tell us what you need to get up to full compliance with where you need to be with the with our 2008 Act. But we need to make sure that we have a functioning SBA after tragedies. And to that extent, I can follow up on Mr. West's question about your reserves. And do you think you have an adequate workforce? And I won't use Katrina because that may be a little overwhelming. But let's use Rita or Gustav or Ike. Do you think you have an adequate workforce if those were to happen next hurricane season, that you could ramp up and be there?
Congressman, we're prepared. There's no doubt about it in my mind. When you look back at Katrina and you look at today, there's several key differences that we have. One is, I mentioned, the infrastructure. You know, we only had 366 seats for individuals to process loans. Now we have 2,100. We could only get people on our staff on our computer, only 800 at a time. Now we can get 10,000 people on the system at the time. And we didn't have a reserve force. We had 866 employees when Katrina hit, so we had to go out and we had to hire all of these employees, local hires, Schedule A's. It was a very ad hoc approach. Now we have an ODA staffing strategy that actually has 850 core employees, and we have 2,000 reservists that we can call on, and they're readily available within 24, 48 hours. The hurricanes Gustav and Ike, we processed about 100,000 applications, a little bit short of 100,000 applications, and we approved about $1 billion worth of loan activity. I need to go back and double check, but my recollection from 2008 is we had about 2,500 employees. We weren't as efficient back then as we are today with all the process improvements. So we feel that we have a very comfortable bandwidth from 0 to 3,000 employees. As we go into Surge and Surge Plus, we have the capability of pulling in contracts, talking to private lenders, and working through that process. So we feel that we're as you know, Mr. Scheer said earlier, we're as prepared as we've ever been from an agency perspective.
The other question, and looking at going all the way back really to Andrew, and when Katrina first happened, they said it'd be a 10-year recovery period, which I truly now know that it's a true 10-year recovery period. But for those small business programs that have time periods in which people or businesses can participate in them, do you think it would be wise to give the administration discretion that when we have a federally declared disaster, that time period is told or frozen? For example, let's consider the 8A program, where in Louisiana those businesses were shut down for 2 years. Well, but they lose those 2 years in the 8A program and they still graduate out on schedule. Do you think it would be wise in any federally declared disaster where recovery is over a certain number of years to extend a person's length of participation in the program?
In reference to the 8A program, Congressman?
Yes, or any other program that there's a specific time period.
I would have to go back and have a discussion with the associate administrators over those different divisions. I mean, as you know, I'm been with the disaster program for 22 years, so I wouldn't feel comfortable making a statement on behalf of, on the 8A program as far as the certification process.
Okay, let's shift to BP, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. How are things going with the loan process for the fishermen and the oystermen down there as they still wait on the claims center to process claims, which is slow, if not just not moving at all?
The BP oil spill, we provided, I recall, about $41 million in disaster assistance. It was bridge loans for economic injury disaster loans. So the application period is a little bit longer. We were actually on the ground helping us businesses actually fill out BP or Gulf Coast Claims Facility applications. As our declaration period for applying for assistance is closed, but we still get reports from BP, and I'll be glad to put you in touch with somebody with the Gulf Coast Claims Facility.
Well, I'm in touch with them all the time. And in closing, Mr. Chairman, I would just advocate that the claim center is not working as it's designed, and that facility and that process is really on BP because it is a private actor and they're doing it. But I think we have a role as government to make sure that we're still there with the process for people to borrow money from the SBA, waiting for those BP claims, because here's what's happening in reality. The interim payments are so slow that they don't get them at all, and then BP comes, or the claim center comes, and they offer them little or nothing for a final claim, but they'll offer the final claim without offering any interim. So people are so desperate right now that they're taking really pennies on a dollar in terms of their final claim. And I just think that if they had the ability to rely on an SBA to back them up in the meantime while they're waiting on it, then they wouldn't be at such a unfair playing field to take those claims. I mean, we had a field hearing down there, and people who were owed $150,000 and $200,000 were settling for $5,000 simply because they had bills they had to pay right then and there. So if we could look at opening that up and creating some program that would offer them the ability to stay on their feet awaiting the Gulf Claim Center and the BP process, that would be very, very helpful, and I think it would change the lives of a lot of the fishermen in that entire Gulf Coast area. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Mulvaney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rivera, I believe, down here, sir. I believe I may be unique on this committee. At least I hope that I am, because it's not something I would wish on anybody, but I've actually participated in the Disaster Assistance Relief Program. I showed up at work about 6 months after I had started my own business one morning to find my office furniture floating in the front yard. We had been through a flood, and I was able to get a disaster relief loan from the SBA, and my experience was actually quite good. It was extraordinarily helpful. It was one of the reasons I was interested in participating in this committee when I got here, was because it was a pretty good experience for me. But as I was going over and preparing for this meeting, I tried to remember how I found out about the program. And it occurred to me that I found out through my insurance agent. And one of the things, Ms. Chu and I were just in her district on our subcommittee. One of the things we heard when we were out in California was that the lack of information about SBA programs. A few people knew what the SBA had to offer. And if it hadn't been for that particularly astute insurance agent that I had, I probably never would have found out about the program. So tell me, sir, what it is that you all are doing generally. What are you doing specifically? How are you making information about disaster relief programs and assistance available to the public?
Thank you, Congressman. We've taken a very aggressive marketing and outreach program. I mean, internally, you know, within the SBA has the opportunity. We have an online disaster toolkit for all the SBA employees. So when a disaster strikes, we make sure that all of our employees in the district offices and the centers know what they need to do. We've also provided media training for all regional administrators, district directors, public information officers. Externally, though, what we've done is we've worked with the National League of Cities on emergency training. We actually partnered in 40-plus courses across the country for crisis leadership for local officials. And we've actually set up some really awesome partnerships. For example, we have Agility Recovery Solutions. We've had 15 monthly webinars over the last 15 months. That provides an educational tool for small businesses. PrepareMyBusiness.org is the website. We've also partnered with the American Red Cross and started talking about their Ready rating system to homeowners and to businesses. And we also partner with FEMA and provide the information as far as what SBA does. Branding is a challenge. I mean, there's no doubt about it. When we get into a disaster area, we actually go and we meet with the state officials, the local officials, the congressional delegation. We try to get as much information out as we possibly can. We do public service PSAs in all the disaster-impacted areas. So we continue to send public information officers in the different areas and try to get the word out as best as we can.
Tell me about these partnerships, because one of the things that one of the subcommittees of this committee deal with, the one that I chair, deals a lot with outsourcing versus insourcing opportunities that the government has to outsource things. You mentioned the webinars. You mentioned the website. That's I understand that that's a partnership with a private entity.
Yes, Agility Recovery Solutions is a small business
tell me how that's working out. Tell me how you measure success. Do you consider it to be a success? What are the metrics? How many visits are you getting? Do you get the impression that it's actually having an impact?
I really do think we're having a pretty significant impact. On the monthly webinars, I did one not too long ago. The title is a little bit interesting. My mom was really excited about it. It was about the 10 Commandments of Disaster Preparedness. I'm not sure how we came up with the 10 Commandments, but anyways, we had about 800 people that actually got on the webinar and participated in the webinar. So, it's 800 more businesses, I hope, that hear about SBA, and that's a big challenge that we've been discussing with GAO and Bill Scheer over the years is how do we get as much information out as we possibly can. I go to a lot of lending conferences. I go to a lot of different types of conferences. Most individuals really don't want to hear about disaster until they've had one. And they really get it once they're in a disaster. Okay, what do I need to do now? And that's why the Ready Rating System and the Agility Recovery Solutions, those are just fabulous partners because they're talking about what you need to do to prepare. You may still have that disaster, but if you have the ability to be prepared, it makes that disaster process, you can go back to your muscle memory and figure out, well, this is what I need to do instead of being in panic stage and not being able to help yourself through the disaster.
Well, I'm going to commend your group, the administration, because we've actually done a good bit of work in South Carolina. The local office has reached out to me. We've toured my district to put on presentations on how to not only start your small business, but after you've started it, what you need to do, and they actually have a list of things that you can do or you should do when things are pretty good, because the time to prepare for a disaster, obviously not the day after that you experience one. So to the extent sometimes it's no fun to come down and testify before these committees, I want to thank you for what you folks are doing in this particular area. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Before we go to our second round, let me make a little comment and ask a question. Mr. Barletta mentioned the funds that we vote to give to other countries or to send to other countries for flood relief, for instance, some disaster relief. Are those loans, do we expect to get that money back?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with this foreign loan program. I apologize. I mean, I can go get some due diligence done and provide information for the record, but I really have no knowledge of this foreign loan program.
I'm not sure these are loans. I suspect that they are grants, that they're simply given to them, and I want to identify myself with Mr. Barletta's observation that, charity ought to begin at home. It frequently doesn't, does it? Several years ago, we had a major drought in the district I'm honored to represent. It's a largely agricultural district, and there was a near total crop failure. And the Department of Agriculture came by and said, gee, we want to help. And so they had some low-interest loans that they wanted to give to my farmers. And one of the farmers got up, he said, I'm now standing on my tiptoes in a sea of debt, about 6 feet deep with my nose barely above water, and you want to add another 2 feet to that sea of debt. I'm just going to drown. What he needed, of course, was not another loan, but he needed a grant. He needed some help to see him through this crisis. Do we have that kind of a program available to those for whom a low-interest loan just can't make it?
In reference to a disaster?
Yes, the disaster relief.
Well, in reference to farmers also?
No, but the reference to anybody, any small farmers are one type of small business,
right.
Of course.
Well, a loan isn't always the right option for some individuals, some homeowners, and some businesses. We are providing debt on top of debt in many cases, and we just don't want to burden somebody if they can't repay a loan. We just don't, if they don't have reasonable repayment ability and adequate credit, we're just not going to go that extra step from that perspective, because what it does is it just puts them closer to bankruptcy, and that's not our objective here. We're just trying to help businesses that can qualify for loans and try to make them recover from that perspective. In the case of businesses, we refer them to the resource partners, and a local SBDC may be able to work out and figure out if there's a way that you can assist this business, help them with their local lender, and maybe they can restructure their debt. And there's a lot of non-disaster type situations in SBDC, and our resource partners can help these type of small businesses.
I'm not a big government advocate, but at least to some extent, with the taxes that we pay, small businesses, I think, have a right to see, to view some of those taxes as a kind of an insurance premium payment. And, what we do in insurance, of course, is to spread the risk. Each person pays a little. Not everybody will have a disaster, but those that do can then be recompensed for it. Don't you think that that our small businesses, at least to some extent, could view some of the taxes they pay as a kind of an insurance premium, that when it's really tough and they're going under, if they don't get some direct help, not just a low-interest loan, if you're simply burying them deeper in a sea of debt, that's not going to be helpful, is it?
Congressman, that's a great question. From the perspective of the disaster loan program, I mean, that's what I feel comfortable responding to.
Because you're in disaster loans, you're not in disaster grants. Okay, but this is a legitimate question, I think, that we need to consider. And I'm not an advocate of big government. Mr. Mulvaney indicated that he learned about your existence from his church, I think he said. Do you partner with FEMA and other agencies so that when there is a disaster, there are many small businesses out there that don't even know that you exist, because they've gone out on their own. They haven't had a loan from small business and don't even know you exist, and so they have a disaster. And do you show up with a desk along with desks of other representatives of the government to let them know that you're there?
Well, we're co-located with FEMA at all of the joint information centers, the disaster recovery centers. Anywhere FEMA's at on the ground, we're actually at on the ground also. And like I mentioned earlier, with Congressman Barletta, he identified some pockets of businesses, and we set up a business recovery center that was SBA only, and it provided some resource partners like SBDCs and stuff.
So if I'm a small business and I have a disaster and FEMA shows up, either to their right or their left, I'm going to see your desk so I know you're there.
Yes, sir. We're always there with FEMA.
Thank you very much. Ms. Velasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rivera, can you tell the committee what will be the timetable for full implementation of all the 26 provisions contained in the Act?
Congressman Velasquez, we feel that we've completed 23 of the 26, and we're continuing to work towards, working with Mr. Scheer and GAO. The remaining 3 loan programs, the IDAP, the Immediate Disaster Assistance, the $25,000 loan program, the Bridge Loan Program, we're working right now with the Office of Capital Access. We've promulgated regs. We have actual loan authority.
When do you think will be ready?
Well, we'll continue to work with the Office of Capital Access, and I know that that's one of their priorities as we move forward, so hopefully in the near future.
So next year, we're not going to be conducting an oversight, and you're not going to give me the same answer.
If we have a hearing next year, hopefully we'll have this program implemented, because all we need to do is go out and do the pilot with the 7A lenders, and we're basically in place, and from that perspective, so we're pretty close.
2 years ago, Mr. Rivera, Administrator Mills appeared before the committee and clearly stated her commitment to improve the agency's disaster readiness. And I am concerned that for this fiscal year, your agency has proposed reducing the personnel of the disaster loan program by 150 full-time employees. And so my question to you is, this, based on the assessment that your agency had in the budget submission, says that will reduce to 3 weeks the application, the processing of some of the applications. Study has shown that when a disaster strike, is the small business doesn't get help, disaster assistance, within the 3-4 weeks, probably that business will close. So aren't you concerned that this is going to impact the readiness of the program?
Well, Congresswoman Velasquez, the FY12 budget did go from, as comparison to the FY11 budget, the FY12 budget proposal does go from 1,000 Full-time equivalents to 850, yes, ma'am. We feel with that, that's now our core, and we feel with the core and the surge and the staffing strategy we have in place, we feel comfortable that we can do this. We don't keep staff if we don't need them. So if we don't have disaster activity, we go down to...
That's the problem. We don't know when the next Katrina is going to strike.
Yes, ma'am. You're absolutely correct. And what we have with the staffing strategy is we have this Surge and Surge Plus approach where we have these individuals that actually have signed up with us and are ready to show up in 24 to 48 hours. And these are the 2,000 employees that we have in the surge pool.
Mr. Scheer, in your prior reports on this program, you have stressed that disaster preparation depends on the agency's ability to identify and balance risks against available agency resources. So how do you balance this out in terms of the reduction of 150? Will that compromise the agency's ability to identify and balance risk?
I can't answer the question on 150 exactly. But one of the things I've said to this committee before is that, many times I'm here before this committee and we're talking about programs other than disaster assistance, and we're saying, well, programs are fragmented. We're looking to get rid of redundancies or programs that don't leverage each other effectively. But disaster assistance is a different business. And so I'll just repeat the points from before. You want some redundancy in the system. And the thing that, if I were Mr. Rivera or this committee, or I'll just say as a public citizen, that would cause me to lose sleep at night is that once, whether it's a 9/11 or a Katrina, and that is way in the past, do people forget so much that you don't have the reserves in place that they're available? So it's a huge problem. How do you balance those? Because there's a cost of having reserves in place. But it's disaster recovery, you have to have some concept of risk management. These simulation exercises are part of establishing that framework, and you have to be responsive to the risks that are out there, and we hope that that's occurring.
Mr. Rivera, how should this committee and the American public judge your agency's success in responding to a major disaster? Should we look at the percentage of loans disbursed, the number of dollars loaned, customer satisfaction surveys, or something else?
Congresswoman, I think you hit on all the factors that we look at. I mean, for example, we do the independent survey with the American Customer Satisfaction Index. Out of a score of 100, we actually scored 80%. It's an independent survey. We have no control. We contract that survey out. We also believe that we're prepared. We believe we have a good workforce in place. They're well trained. We continue to work on process improvements, try to make ourselves as efficient as possible, and continue to collaborate and work closely with FEMA and other federal agencies, HUD, and just go across Internal Revenue Service, and just continue to try to be as proactive as we possibly can.
Well, I'm glad to hear that this committee got it right when we passed the legislation in 2008. But now we need full implementation of those provisions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, quick question. How much do you think it costs you all to service, let's say, an SBA loan from Katrina Rita in a percentage point?
I would have to get back with you. I don't know that exact dollar. I know that we spend on average about 160 to 200 million a year for the disaster loan making and disaster loan servicing perspective. But the actual cost, the unit cost, I'd have to get back with you for the record.
Because I guess I'm interested in all of the loans that were done after Hurricane Rita and Katrina, and to that extent, Gustav and Ike also, that the interest rate with an SBA loan is above what it costs you to service that loan. And part of the question becomes, what's the rationale for the difference? Where does the money go? Does it go into future programming, future loans? But to the extent that it can help, it could help people in terms of reducing their interest payment, it would just serve wonders to people in those devastated areas if we could give them some relief on those interest rates above what it cost us to service them. We ought not make a profit, and we ought not let government grow on the backs of people who just went through a disaster. So I would be interested in what it's costing to service them, what's the average percentage rate, and what that means in the terms of real dollars.
Yes, sir. We'll get back with you for the record.
And then, Mr. Chairman, that's it. I'd like to thank Mr. Chair and Mr. Rivera for coming today, and thank the SBA for what they do. And my district has been a constant beneficiary of their work. We don't want to be, but it just so happens that if it's not one thing, it's another. And thank you for what you do.
Thank you very much. In its annual report on top management challenges, the SBA's Inspector General reports that improper payments in the disaster program were underestimated by close to $1.4 billion. How much of this was in your area, and what is being done to address this problem?
Congressman, the improper payments process that we had, the audit that we had with the Office of Inspector General, we took a very proactive approach and have re-engineered how we do the process. Under the old process, the director in the Texas office had control of the improper payments and the calculation. Currently, we have my director up in headquarters who's in charge of loan programs that actually goes through that process. So it's completely re-engineered. We continue to work on the improper payments and continue to reduce that percentage.
So after the next disaster, the Inspector General will not be able to make a report like this. Is that correct?
Well, that's always our goal.
Thank you. Okay, as I anticipated, my colleagues have done a good job of asking the questions. When we look at the record, we may decide that there are other questions that we need to ask one or both of you so that we have a complete record for the future. And we hope that you can respond for the record if we ask those questions. I'd like to end by thanking both of our witnesses for appearing today. Providing assistance in the aftermath of a disaster is a fundamental mission and something that we have the responsibility to get right. While SBA has improved the process for many disaster victims, we need to make sure that these improvements continue, that we're prepared for any disaster that might come our way. This committee will continue to monitor SBA's performance to make sure that we are helping our neighbors when they need it most. With that, I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered. The subcommittee now stands in adjournment.
Thank you.